actual aspirations for their lives. People aspire to have more friends, absolutely. People aspire to be able to live more independently. People aspire to be able to communicate more effectively. People aspire to be able to find and keep a job, to have romantic relationships, any number of other things. But generally speaking, people don't aspire to be as indistinguishable as possible. And if they do, it's often because they have been subject to all manner of abuse because they are not indistinguishable. And Lovas's idea that through behavioral intervention, autistic children could be made indistinguishable and thus recovered from being autistic was, again, a very popular and very damaging idea that held sway in the autism community for a great many decades. Now let's come a little bit closer to the modern age, because you see the early 90s come around, and there is a fairly powerful autism parent movement, but there is not much in terms of an autistic self-advocacy movement. And many autistic people, and you sort of are seeing one of the first generations of autistic people who in any considerable amount of numbers grow up knowing that they're autistic in the 90s. There have been some people, earlier, Temple Grandin, a couple of others, but, it was not very common prior to that time. Many autistic people start to ask ourselves, well, hang on, in the rest of the disability rights movement, they're talking about services and supports and equality of opportunity. Just a few years ago, in 1990, Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which says the goals of the nation, this is finding, I believe it's number 7, you can check, finding number 7 in the Americans with Disabilities Act. Congress finds that the goals of the nation with regards to disability should be equality of opportunity, independent living, economic self-sufficiency, and full participation. And autistic people start to ask ourselves, hang on a moment, why don't the people advocating for us talk about those kinds of things? Why don't they talk about equal rights? Why don't they talk about services and supports? Why don't they talk about inclusion? And why don't we have a voice at the table? Because let's go back now to that beginning of the modern disability rights movement. Because while Rimland and Lovas were wreaking their havoc in the autism world, you saw something very different occur in the disability rights world. As deinstitutionalization gained steam, both parents and self-advocates, and I want to be very upfront about this, parents played a tremendously important role in the larger developmental disability advocacy movement and in early advocacy for inclusion there. So, I am by no means anti-parent advocacy, despite some of the unique pathologies that have existed in the parent advocacy in some parts of the autism world. But in the larger developmental disability world, you saw advocacy by parents and self-advocates that was very different. In Park v. Pennsylvania, a very notable district court or circuit court decision, federal circuit court decision in Pennsylvania, families sued the state for the right for their children to attend public school. And Park v. Pennsylvania found that the Constitution of the United States of America, under its Equal Protection Clause, guaranteed the right of students with disabilities to attend public school. And shortly after the Park v. Pennsylvania decision, you had Congress pass the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It was called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act then, but it's the predecessor to today's IDEA, establishing a right for children with disabilities to have access to a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. A lot of people think that right was created by Congress. No, it actually comes from the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't have that language in there, but the courts were establishing that right, were reading that right into the Constitution, even before Congress acted to create a broader structure through which that right could be made actionable. So you see that kind of advocacy. You also see the passage in 1973 of the Rehabilitation Act. And the Rehabilitation Act did a lot of things, put more funding to both rehab agencies to help disabled people find jobs, created centers for independent living. But the most important thing that the Rehabilitation Act did was establish something called Section 504. Well, thank you. And Section 504 I will tell you about just as soon as I have this refreshing drink of water. And thank you for the person who brought it over here, Marco Rubio. I am not. Very kind of you. Section 504 said that any entity, whether you're a school or a state government or a public building or what have you, any entity that receives federal funding has to be accessible to people with disabilities, has to not discriminate against people with disabilities, and has to make reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. And that was a very big deal. In fact, it was such a big deal that the lobbyists for the hospital associations and for the universities and for many other sectors didn't want to do it. And so, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. When Congress passes a law, it doesn't, get implemented right away. The executive branch, basically the president and the cabinet departments, have to issue regulations describing how it will be implemented. And 4 years after the Rehabilitation Act was passed, the regulations were still not forthcoming. And so Section 504 was not being implemented. There was intense lobbying not to issue the regulations or to issue them in a much weakened form. So a group of disability rights advocates led by Ed Roberts, Judy Heumann, Bob Williams, many others, decided to engage in simultaneous sit-ins at federal buildings for the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare across the country. And in most of those parts of the country, the sit-ins didn't stick, except very nearby here in San Francisco. In San Francisco, over 100 disabled people spent a month living, eating, going to the bathroom, basically everything, in the lobby of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, refusing to leave until those regulations were implemented. Were issued. It is, to this day, the longest takeover of a federal building in American history. Nice. And at the end of that month, and by the way, the 504 sit-in is notable for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons it's notable is that it's one of the few points where you see real cross-movement solidarity. Local gay rights activists helped organize media for the 504 sit-in. I think local African-American activists helped to run food and walkie-talkies to the sit-in participants. I mean, it was a real moment where everybody came together in a way that you haven't seen a lot of in the subsequent decades. So at the end of that month, the 504 regulations were issued, and they were strong, and they were good, and they set the stage for the later Americans with Disabilities Act. So you were seeing a lot of this kind of advocacy. Some of it was in the developmental disability movement. Others, like the 504 sit-in, was in the broader disability rights movement. And now you come into the 1990s, and the autism movement is still dominated primarily by parents. It's still focused almost exclusively around causation. What causes autism? Or this idea that you can somehow magically make a autistic person non-autistic through the right, pill or pseudoscientific intervention or behavioral intervention, or any number of other things that ranged from unscientific to downright abusive. And all of a sudden, this first generation of autistic people who, in any significant number, grew up knowing they were autistic, start to ask, why can't we have what they have in the broader disability rights movement? Clearly, these guys just passed a major national civil rights law, the Americans with Disabilities Act. We are now living in the post-ADA world. When's that going to come to the autism community? And you started to see, for the very first time, the rise of a self-advocacy movement in the autism world. And because the main issue in the autism world was taking control of this national conversation on autism from the parent movement and getting representation for self-advocates and moving the conversation away from causation and cure and recovery, the autistic self-advocacy movement came up with this idea called neurodiversity. It's short for neurological diversity. And basically the neurodiversity idea says that the goal of autism advocacy or of autism research or of autism intervention or services or any number of other things should be to create a world in which autistic people are supported, happy, included, and have equality of opportunity, not to create a world in which there are no autistic people. And that was a huge sea change. Jim Sinclair, who in some ways is the kind of the person who played the biggest role in starting the neurodiversity movement, wrote this famous essay called "Don't Mourn for Us." And it was an open letter to parents. And in it, what Jim wrote was that when you say, "I wish my child did not have autism," what you are in fact saying, what Jim was saying was, what we hear is, "I wish I did not have the child I have now, and that I had a different child that's more to my liking in its place." That autism, and this is one of the ideas of the neurodiversity movement, being the way that our brains work, is not separable from who we are or how we see ourselves, and that autism should not be incompatible with quality of life, equality of opportunity, and all these other things. That the goal of services and support should not be to try and make someone indistinguishable from their peers, but to try and make somebody have access to the services and supports that they want, have access to the communication skills they want, have access to the kind of life that they want. And that was a big change. In a lot of ways, neurodiversity, what neurodiversity is about, is trying to make the autism world more like the broader disability rights world. Because the emphasis on causation had meant that a lot of the efforts to get people out of institutions, a lot of the efforts to get people included in public school, a lot of the efforts to empower communication hadn't moved as fast in the autism world as they had in the intellectual disability or broader developmental disability world. And there's kind of a process of self-selection. If you're a parent who wants to focus on services and supports and inclusion, then you've got a choice between joining a local autism organization that's focused mainly on causation or joining a broader developmental disability organization that's focused on a broader scope of things. You're probably going to self-select into the broader developmental disability organization. This isn't universally the case, and there were some pockets of excellence. The Autism National Committee, a number of other local groups in which autism parents did take a more progressive perspective. But in a lot of ways, the push for inclusion and the push for disability rights to come to the autism world was most likely to come from self-advocates. And in that period in the 1990s, it did for the first time. ASAN, the organization I work for, was founded in 2006. And when we founded the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, what we were looking to do was to try and find a way to take the principles of neurodiversity and the principles of disability rights and to really advance them in a way that was led by self-advocates, led by autistic people ourselves, into places of power, public policy, research settings, any number of other places. We felt like we had talked about these concepts for a long time, and we certainly believed in them. In fact, by 2006, you had a generation of autistic people who had been thinking about them, ever since we were, teenagers or adolescents. And so neurodiversity was starting to catch on in a big way. But if you looked at how people in the public talked about autism, neurodiversity and self-advocate voices weren't really there. I'll give you an example. Shortly before ASAN was founded, Autism Speaks, which is a large and very prominent autism organization that ASAN has a lot of problems with. In fact, the members of ASAN Sacramento and many other ASAN chapters have protested Autism Speaks fundraisers because it's an organization that does not include autistic people in its senior leadership, talks about us without us, and only about 4% of funds donated to Autism Speaks go to services for autistic people and their families. But before ASAN was founded, Autism Speaks put out a fundraising video called Autism Every Day. And in the video, when they were preparing it, they told the families that they were interviewing, I want you to not take your child for services for a week beforehand, before we come to videotape you. I want you to not clean your houses. I want you to not, engage in basic hygiene. We want you to look as pathetic as possible for the video cameras, because that's what's going to raise money. And one of their senior executives in this video, with her daughter sitting in front of her, talked about how she had seriously considered putting her autistic daughter, the one that was sitting in front of her, right when she was saying this, in the car and driving off the George Washington Bridge. But she didn't, because she had a normal child as well, and she had to hold on for the sake of the normal child. In some ways, history comes full circle, and if you think about where we started, it's terrifying to think that our history is not that far away from that. So ASAN was founded to try and change that conversation. And we made, and I think we are still making, a lot of progress. So I'll check the time. So we have at least 30 to 45 minutes for questions. So I'm going to take another 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll go to questions. In 2007, a year after ASAN was founded, New York University Child Study Center decided to put on an ad campaign in which they put billboards and posters and magazine ads all over New York City. It was a big-time ad campaign. It was put together by BBDO, which is the ad agency that does Coca-Cola's ads. It's a big deal. If you ever watch Mad Men, BBDO, comes up sometimes. Very old, reputable ad agency. And the New York University Child Study Center ad campaign was called Ransom Notes. And the Ransom Notes campaign consisted of a series of fake ransom notes claiming to be from particular disabilities that had somehow kidnapped a child and left God knows what in its place. So, for example, they had one for autism that said something to the effect of, we have your son, we'll make it impossible for him to have friends or communicate as long as he lives, see what happens now, signed autism. They had one for ADHD that said, we have your child, we'll make him fidget and squirm till he is a detriment to himself and everyone around him. See what happens if you do nothing, signed ADHD. And the idea behind these ads was that folks would see them and take their kids to the NYU Child Study Center and get services from there. But imagine walking down the street to a job interview or taking your child to an IEP meeting and knowing that the person you're going to be sitting across the table from has just been told by New York University, BBDO, and, the magazines and billboards that ran the ads that you or your child is a detriment to themselves and everyone around them. Imagine the impact that has on public acceptance of people with disabilities. And so we mobilized. The ads were supposed to run for 5 months and then go to 5 other cities. We were able to stop them in 2 weeks by organizing disability rights groups to sign a joint letter, get their constituents to sign a petition, and call and email the NYU Child Study Center. Incidentally, we also had them call and email some of the funders for the NYU Child Study Center, which may have played a bigger role in why they eventually capitulated, and tell them that this was unacceptable. And one of the things that sort of came out of that is because we were able to score that big victory, afterwards it became easier to score smaller victories. Similar ad campaigns, did occasionally and still do occasionally pop up, but it was much easier for ASAN, either at the national level or through our chapters. Our Seattle chapter just stopped something very similar last year, to respond to them, because when folks looked at the history of what we had done before, they realized, oh, hey, you do have to listen to autistic people, or they'll come after you. We had started to build power for our community, because we have a lot of good arguments. Okay, we've got a lot of good ideas. We've got a lot of good things to contribute. But at the end of the day, unless we can organize, unless we could come together and project power, unless we could tell people in government, in universities, in organizations, many other places, that if you don't listen to us, we are going to speak up. We're not just going to quietly go away. And we're glad to collaborate with you. We collaborate with any number of parent organizations, universities, government agencies, and so on and such forth. But if you don't want to collaborate with us, we're not going to sit by and do nothing either. That has a big impact. And it's had a big impact beyond just media representation. I don't want to leave you with the impression that the only thing the neurodiversity movement is about is changing how people talk about autism. The neurodiversity movement, like the larger disability rights movement, is about changing public policy, services, supports, and all these other things that autistic people and other people with disabilities, neurodiversity isn't just about autism, interact with over the course of our lifespan. Advocates in ASAN and the neurodiversity movement have been playing a big role, along with other disability rights advocates, in challenging the sheltered workshop industry. Sheltered workshops are segregated work centers where disabled people are paid less than minimum wage. And we want to see sheltered workshops phased out over time so that people in them can be supported into integrated employment opportunities where they get minimum wage or above. And we've been calling attention to this not only through lobbying state governments to change, and I'm proud to say, by the way, that the governments of Oregon, New York, and Massachusetts have in the last 2 years announced they will be phasing out the use of sheltered workshops. Vermont has had no sheltered workshops since 2003. But we're also putting pressure on the people who are lobbying to keep sub-minimum wage in federal law. Goodwill Industries. How many of you have heard of Goodwill? The Goodwill Industries, okay, spends a lot of money lobbying Congress to maintain the right to pay disabled workers less than minimum wage, even though the CEO of Goodwill Industries makes over $500,000.
Yeah. Wow.
And executives at regional Goodwill Industry affiliates all over the country also make salaries into the mid-six figures. So we've been lobbying, we've been advocating, and ASAN chapters and chapters of the National Federation of the Blind and other groups, there's a lot of solidarity across disability groups now, have been bringing petitions and protests and all kinds of other things to Goodwill affiliates all over the country. It's generated media attention, it's generated a lot of other things. We've also been telling the government what kinds of services we do and we don't want. One of the things we're very worried about is as we see progress being made on deinstitutionalization, and we've made tremendous progress. Today, 13 states have no state-run institutions for people with developmental disabilities, and a smaller number of states, I think it's 4, have no institutions for people with developmental disabilities altogether. We want to make sure that we keep that progress, we keep it moving, and we also do not see states backslide by reopening institutions under another name. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. About 5 years ago, the state of Missouri decided that they were going to close the Nevada Developmental Center. In Missouri, it's called the Nevada Developmental Center, bear with me, which was an institution. And they were going to take the people in that institution, and they were going to put them in 4 group homes, or in a number of group homes, on the grounds of the old institution, around which they were going to put a fence. And it was going to have the same staff as the old institution, and was going to be in the same place as the old institution. The buildings would be a little bit, it would be a few more buildings, but, you could only leave if you had permission to exit the fence, and they were going to call this a gated community, for which they wanted to use federal home and community-based services dollars. And we were able to successfully lobby the federal government to tell them, no, that's not in the community, in fact, and you can't use community services dollars for it. But there are other people who are trying to build these kinds of settings, and it's a very big problem. Last week, after 4 years of lobbying the federal government on this, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services issued new regulations, which we believe would prohibit Medicaid funds from going to those kinds of settings. It was an incredible victory, not just for ASAN, but also for other self-advocacy groups. We've worked with self-advocates becoming empowered. We worked with the NDRN, the National Disability Rights Network, which represents protection and advocacy agencies, and many, many other disability rights advocates to get that victory. And what we are trying to do is to see a recognition that deinstitutionalization is about a lot of things. It's about keeping people out of institutions and these kind of neo-institutions, these gated communities. By the way, the difference between these gated communities and the gated communities you find down in Boca Raton, Florida, in the Boca gated communities, they're designed to keep undesirable elements out. These are designed to keep undesirable elements in. So, we undesirables think there's a little bit of a difference. But community living is also about more than where we keep people out of. It's also about how we support people when they are living in more integrated settings. It's about saying we want people to have the same rights as anyone else under landlord-tenant law. One of the other things this new regulation does is it says that people with disabilities, in order to be living in the community, need to have the same rights as anyone else would under that local jurisdiction's tenant law rules. So you need to have protections against eviction. You need to have the right to do some of the things you want to your own space. You need, basically certain rights of privacy and self-determination. And in a lot of ways, we think this regulation doesn't go far enough. As we see it, if you're in your 30s and 40s and you still have somebody coming in and telling you, this is your bedtime, and this is when you're allowed to, get up, and this is what you're allowed to, eat, and this is what you have to do during your day, that is not truly living in the community. That's not really being treated like an adult, being empowered to live with dignity.